From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch in Massachusetts. EJ Dionne is a prominent and unmistakable voice on democracy and religion in politics, as well as the dynamics of American political life. It's great to have him back on The State of Belief this week at a time when these themes are even more crucial than they usually are, with a critical election less than 100 days away. In the past couple of years, I've had the privilege of conducting so many memorable interviews with some of the great thinkers and strategists and leaders of our time on this program, The State of Belief. They have given you and me so much encouragement for these difficult times. It's also a way to feel less alone. So I want to make sure that you are subscribed to the State of Belief podcast at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, or just visit stateofbelief.com/subscribe. That way you'll never miss a conversation, and you'll be able to access almost 100 of the past interviews with guests like Dr. Anethea Butler, Jeff Charlotte, Bishop William Barber, Rabbi Sharon Brous, Dr. Jamar Tisby, Rob Reiner, and many, many others. It would be really great to have you subscribe, rate, and tell people you're close to about all that you have been hearing. The State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you. You're helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how to do that is available at stateofbelief.com, and you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my guest. EJ Dionne is a longtime Washington Post political columnist. He's also distinguished university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy, as well as a fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. EJ is the author of a long list of influential books, including Our Divided Political Heart, Sold Out, SOULED, Reclaiming Faith in Politics After the Religious Right, and most recently co-authored with Miles Rappaport, 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting. EJ so often sounds like the better heart of our country, recognizing our differences and the challenges that come with that, but always sounding a realistic note of hope and possibility. My predecessor, the late Reverend Welton Gaddy, once called him a peacemaker when EJ was on the show to unveil his book, Our Divided Political Heart. And that still makes sense today. Which is not to say EJ Dionne is short on strong opinions, and I know we'll hear some of those today. With all that said, EJ Dionne, welcome back to the State of Belief.
Well, bless you for that introduction. And can I return it by saying that I think a lot of listeners know that your name, Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch, includes in it two of the most important small d Democratic voices in our history, Louis Brandeis, foe of monopoly, friend of democracy, and of course, Walter Rauschenbusch, the founder of the social gospel. And the social gospel has had periods of where people have not paid as much attention to it as they should. I think this is the moment where people have to start paying more attention to it than they do. And you carry this tradition proudly, and I honor you for it. So it's great to be here.
Oh, my goodness. Well, EJ, I'm like a fanboy. I remember seeing you at Princeton when you came out with your book, Sold Out, and how just inspiring it was, a packed crowd. And you speak so much sense in this moment. And we are in a moment, I have to say, of nonsense. And so, anyone speaking sense or common sense in this moment just feels like a breath of fresh air. And I just so appreciate all that you have done over the last decades and continue to do. And it's just really important. We're in a kind of a historic moment. We haven't seen anything like it before, where President Biden steps aside. Vice President Kamala Harris is the presumptive nominee, almost assuredly, and we're in just a kind of an amazing moment. As we speak, we're not sure who the vice presidential person will be. There's a lot of really, I would say, pretty good candidates, and I'm just curious if you want to go on the record with a prediction about any one of those candidates and who you think should or will be in that position, not by the time this airs, but pretty shortly afterwards.
Well, I'm going to pass on that question for reasons I'll explain, but
Yeah.
I'm glad you underscored the moment we're speaking, because imagine that if we had had this conversation about a week and a half ago, and that period when after President Biden's debate performance, where as somebody who has really respected and admired President Biden for a long time, I've joked that I'm so old that I covered Joe Biden when he was the new generation candidate back in 1987. And, I grew up in a mill town called Fall River, and Scranton Joe's politics are pretty much like the politics that I sort of adhere to, a kind of labor progressivism or labor liberalism. And so I had a lot of respect for him. I felt that after that debate performance, it was not tenable for him to carry forward. And I think in the enthusiasm you're seeing in the party for Kamala Harris, a couple of things are there. One is just enormous relief that Democrats were really given a very unusual opportunity to start the campaign all over again. It was a little over 100 days before the election. Now it's less than 100 days as we speak. And, a lot of people in the party really liked Biden's record, but just didn't think, especially after that debate, that he could carry this forward. But I also think there is enormous enthusiasm that surprised a lot of people. I'm not entirely surprised by it, but others are, for Harris. And, it is obviously part of it is the way she carries herself and the energy and enthusiasm. And I thought from the beginning, Republicans made a terrible mistake in attacking the way she laughed, because I think in this moment of such division and rancor, a little laughter is actually quite attractive to an awful lot of voters, not just people supporting her. But obviously, there is a special appeal to Kamala Harris, who is of Black and South Asian descent, and a woman. And you saw the outpouring in a lot of different communities. And lastly, young people. Many of them agreed with Biden on a lot of stuff, but there was clearly a lack of enthusiasm for his candidacy. And you saw the Democratic vote shoot up among people under 35, under 30, as soon as Harris became the nominee. So that's extraordinary. The reason why I don't want to make a prediction on or really take a strong stance on any of the Veeps is that I have a lot of good things to say about all of them. And I have theories about how Vice President Harris is thinking, but no hard facts. So, and I think it's a close call for her, as it is, I am learning in my conversations with a lot of people on the Democratic side. I will say a couple of things. I think that in this run up to the choice, in this, if you will, competition for the Veep spot, the quiet, not a divisive competition. I think the guy who probably has emerged most strongly is Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, partly because a lot of people had not paid enough attention to him. I interviewed him last year after what people referred to as the Minnesota Miracle, which is an extraordinary outpouring of progressive legislation in a state legislature that's very closely divided. And I think Walz has made a mark already as a contributor to Democratic messaging. His declaration that the Democrats' opponents are, Vance and Trump are weird, it took off because I think it speaks more to people than more highfalutin or philosophical words. And his defense, when you throw big government liberal at him, he says, well, wait a minute. Is there something wrong with kids going to school on full bellies? Their feeding program is wrong to establish universal child care and so on. So I think he's had a good run. I think Pete Buttigieg, who's amazing messenger always, has had a good run. And it's worth giving him credit because Kamala Harris has done very good work substantively and rhetorically with the word freedom. Pete made that a centerpiece of his 2020 campaign. The campaign was not successful in the end, but he won a lot of support. And then you have, Mark Kelly, who's an extraordinarily fascinating figure. There was a great piece in the Financial Times that said that Wall Street donors are partial to Governor Cooper of North Carolina, who's taken himself out. Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. Hollywood donors are partial to Kelly, and I think they love the storyline of an astronaut on the ticket, and also, obviously, the tragic but ultimately heroic story of the assassination attempt against his wife, Gabby Giffords, and the way he has stepped in the breach on gun issues. And then you have, as well, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who has indicated she doesn't really want it, but has, is an extraordinary voice in Michigan. And lastly, Governor Shapiro. I first really, he got on a lot of our radars by being on TV and doing very good interviews. He really got on my radar at a 2022 rally at the end of the campaign it was for Shapiro and Fetterman. And Joe Biden and Barack Obama spoke. And you could make a case that Shapiro was so powerful that particular day he might have even outshone Barack Obama, which is not something you usually see. So this is, to me, an exceptional group of people. And I think a lot of the Veep choice is based on two calculations. One is intensely personal. Whom do you want to work with? Whom do you want in the room with you when you have a tough decision to make and can say, what do you think? And really trust them. And that's totally personal to her. And the other is a political calculation. And I think that's very complicated in this case. And so I interviewed all five of these folks last year for columns. Oh, Andy Beshear, I forgot to mention. The governor of Kentucky, whom we should talk about because he has spoken very openly about his faith, and it's very important to him.
Well, as has Shapiro and Pete Buttigieg. They've both been really very, it's been very refreshing.
No, I love Pete because he said he may be politically liberal, but he is a liturgical conservative, he once said. I think he's the only Democrat ever running for president who described himself as a liturgical conservative. And you're right, Governor Shapiro is a deeply religious person. He's Jewish, and Shabbat is very important to his family. And he tends to turn down invitations on Friday nights because he wants to honor the Sabbath. And I think I think it's very important, as you and I both agree, that Democrats and progressives speak to religious people. And I think that in this 100%. List, you've got a lot of people who can do that.
And let's not forget the vice president herself, who comes from this very interesting background, where one parent is South Asian Hindu and another parent is from a Christian background. She goes to a historic black college, and then ultimately marries a Jewish man. And so part of my fascination with her, and dating back to something I was saying in 2020, was like someone who's been in that many different spaces religiously is actually a pretty important person for this moment in our country when we are so religiously diverse, that people who can navigate different religious spaces, but also celebrate the difference and recognize that together those things are actually a powerful offering for our country, and actually our religious diversity is a strength, not a weakness. It's an interesting moment for the country when you have, certainly Vice President Harris, but then on the other side, you have this very interesting, very conservative, I think J.D. Vance is a really interesting person. I think as a Catholic, I think he had a conversion experience that made him very conservative. And, he said he hasn't helped himself by saying some things that are really, I think, offensive to the majority of women in America. And I'm just curious how you understand that kind of religious matchup between these two. But he married a Hindu woman. And so it's very interesting how these two candidates, like the religious element of this election, I think is fascinating.
Yeah, I got to say that J.D. Vance's wife was one of the speakers at the Republican convention whom I watched and said, this is an interesting person. And
Yeah.
I'd love to
Yeah.
get to know her more than I do. I just, before I forget it, I want to shout out Bashir with something Bashir told me when I went down there last November to write about right before the election when he got reelected in Kentucky, one of the most Republican states in the Union. And I noted that he had been very open about his religious faith. And, this is something people could put up on their wall if they wanted. He replied to me, he said, for me, faith is about uniting all people. It says all children are children of God. And if you're truly living out your faith, you're not playing into these anger and hatred games. And it would be very nice to have somebody preaching like that around the country on a regular basis, which, of course, many people do. But I was just really struck that that was the way in which he chose to talk about it. And I think in this election, on issues related to religion, one of the fundamental divides is between people who are directly or indirectly, sometimes they're called Christian nationalists, but they don't all have to be called Christian nationalists, but who really do seem to want to argue that the Christian faith is foundational to everything in the American Republic, and that they have the idea that we are in some deep sense a Christian nation. It's obviously true that Christianity was central to the thinking of many of the founders, but the founders were very conscious of not creating a religiously based republic. The First Amendment is a pretty radical idea for its time, and
Absolutely.
It's still a powerful idea in the world. And what you have on the other side, and what I think you should have on the other side, are not people who disrespect religion or religious people, but who respect religion so much that they don't want to have the state interfering in people's religious lives. And, on J.D. Vance's faith, Paul Ely, my Georgetown colleague and great writer for The New Yorker, had a really good piece I commend to people on J.D. Vance's conversion to Catholicism. And I think what you're seeing in the Catholic Church my mom was a librarian, so I have this bad habit of suggesting readings to people. Like my mom used to suggest books to people. A National Catholic Reporter had a very good editorial on the bishops and the deal that some of them have made with the Republican Party. You do have a very, a real argument going on. I'll put it gently. Within, my tradition, the Catholic tradition, between an emphasis on social justice and on all those parts of the scripture that lift up the poor, which is on the whole exactly where Pope Francis is coming from, and a rather radically conservative wing of the church, some of whom are skeptical about democracy itself and are quite open about that. And so that argument is being carried out in a lot of our traditions. It's certainly being carried out within the Catholic tradition. And I think that argument will underlie this campaign. I don't think it'll be the centerpiece of the campaign, because I think the voters who will decide the election care more about jobs and prices and some other issues. But I think it will be very, very important. And obviously the abortion issue will be important, which touches on these debates about religion.
Right. I think it's one of the interesting phenomenon of the past 30 years that I know you've commented on a lot, but you and I represent a kind of a tradition in religion that is equally legitimate as the more conservative religious traditions, and yet somehow religion. There is an even in conversations on the Hill, people tend to say, okay, it's religion versus the secular progressives, and that's actually just like the false dichotomy. I mean, if you look at many of the issues, even the culture war issues, so to speak, religion is on the side of, marriage equality and LGBTQ equality. I mean, almost 70% of religious people do support some kind of marriage equality for LGBT people. It's also with abortion and with a lot of the social issues that come up. It's not like the religious folks are uniformly against these things. They're not. And yet there's a kind of a narrative that we're still fighting against, is like, that there's religion versus progressive. And that's just, it's not the way that it carries out. But I think the Democratic Party is always a little bit like trying to figure out how to do it. And but there are a lot of people in the, as you've mentioned a few of them, like I think Josh Shapiro, the way he talked about religion in his campaign against Mastriano was super interesting. I mean, he really represented a different way forward. And Mastriano was really one of the most openly kind of Christian nationalist candidates we've had in recent years. And Josh Shapiro really pummeled him. And it was really, that was an example. I'm curious how, you look back at your understanding of the religious right. You wrote a book about Sold Out, and it has the language after the religious right. How have you understood the religious right as its inception, but then how is it morphed? Like, what is the language that you use to describe what's happened to those on the right who have really rallied using religion as a rallying point over the last 20 years, but specifically in conjunction with the candidacy and presidency of Donald Trump?
We all have things we like in books we've written, and I enjoyed writing that book, and I stand by almost everything I said in that book. But I think in retrospect, it can be said that I underestimated the staying power of the religious right. We should all acknowledge error. And I think, and I'd be happy to talk about that.
I'm not trying to, it's not a gotcha moment. I was just,
No. I'm saying that, I'm Catholic. We confess sin. That's what we do. And this was
okay. I'm not Catholic.
On my part.
I'll still absolve you.
Let me tell a story. I may have said this years ago when I was on with Welton, God bless his soul. I have always been taken by the following story that when Tim Kaine ran for governor of Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, ran for governor of Virginia, he was opposed to the death penalty. And his campaign knew that he was going to be attacked for that at some point. And they had an ad in the can. And Tim Kaine's a very religious person. Religion is deeply important to him, and he's acted on his faith in his own life. And the ad they put out is began with Tim Kaine speaking, saying, "I am against the death penalty because I believe that all life, my faith teaches me that all life is sacred." And he went on to say he'd enforce the law of Virginia, but he didn't shy away from saying on religious grounds he was opposed to the death penalty. And when his campaign did focus groups after of that ad, one of the reactions from people was not about the death penalty. It was, Tim Kaine can't possibly be a liberal because he's religious. And that's kind of what's happened to religion in our country. And I think it goes all the way back to the rise of the religious right in the late 70s and early 80s when President Reagan won the election and took office, where so much attention was given to the religious right. 20, 30 years earlier, people like Reinhold Niebuhr or Paul Tillich were on the cover of Time magazine. But for a very long time, because of the political power of the religious right, religion was spoken of in this way. I think there's a particular challenge both to, if you will, to use a debated term, mainline traditions, because they tend to be politically diverse, much more politically diverse than conservative, than white evangelical churches are. And secondly, the Democratic Party has a very complicated coalition problem on religion that they're constantly thinking about. And it's why they keep looking over their shoulders about religion, because you could argue just from the polls that the Democrats include the most religious people in the country by virtue of how often they go to houses of worship, what they say about their faith, which would be African Americans, Black Americans. And on the other hand, the least religious people in the country who are secular, who are known as the religious nuns, who don't identify with any religious traditions. And then all kinds of people in the middle, Jews, Hindus, Muslims, and people who adhere to all kinds of other faiths. And then, of course, Catholics and Protestants. So that Democrats are often reluctant to enter this terrain because they don't want to blow up their coalition. And lastly, I think it's because the mainstream media have tended to be much more focused on, as I mentioned at the beginning, the conservative part of the religious world than they used to be, back before the rise of the religious right. So I think all of this has had an effect on how we talk about religion. And I say this sometimes to my conservative Christian friends that, you are sending a message to a lot of young people who don't agree with you on some of these issues, particularly, I would say, LGBTQ rights. And you're saying that being a good Christian means that you have to oppose these rights. And a lot of young people are walking away from religion as a result. And so I wanted to have, someday when our politics is a little less divisive, it'd be nice if we could have a quieter conversation within our traditions and say, let's look at where young people are on religion right now, and what people in our traditions might be doing, not to bring them in, but to push them away.
Yeah, well, you'll appreciate this story perhaps, but I was offered the opportunity to give the commencement address several years ago at Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School, which is where my great grandfather taught and Martin Luther King Jr. attended, and it was right after one of these big surveys where talking about how many young people had left the church. And what I just said is, like, I'm not like a traditional evangelical where everybody has to be a Christian for me to love them or anything like that. What I am sad about is that I feel like people are getting a misrepresentation of Jesus, and they're leaving the church because of that. And so that felt like, along the lines of what you had just offered I do think that we're, it's sad for those of us who remain within the tradition to some, I'm raising my kids within the tradition but it is, it's sad that so many people, sometime with the loudest mic, might be turning folks off. Up next, much more with writer and commentator EJ Dionne. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch. My guest is Washington Post columnist, author, and commentator, EJ Dionne. I wanted to turn to your latest book about 100% democracy, The Case for Universal Voting. Tell me about why you decided to write that, and what does that really mean, especially in light of all the efforts which seem to be continuing to get people, purge people from rolls and get people who are legitimately able to vote off the ability, like voter suppression. What was the prompt to write this book, and what does it really mean?
Well, I've been interested in this idea for quite a while, partly because I happen to have spent, for various reasons, quite a bit of time in Australia, which has had a version of this system for 100 years, almost 100 years. They call it compulsory attendance at the polls. And in Australia, all citizens are required to cast ballots. Now, the penalties are very low. They're like, I think, $15 American right now at the exchange rate, something like that. Most people don't actually have to pay the fine if they have a reasonable excuse for why they didn't vote. But what they've done in Australia is two things. One, the government helps register people and makes it very easy to register to vote, so that 96% of Australians are registered to vote. And they make it easy to cast ballots, and 90% of them vote in every election. And so what they've done with this is they've created a culture of participation across across the country. And election day is like a party. They hold elections on Saturdays. A lot of the polling places are in schools. Over the years, civic groups, and now it's true at every polling place, use the election to raise money for various school causes, civic causes. So they sell food at every polling place. It's become so common that there are websites now that grade the food at each polling place, and you can look up and you can vote anywhere in your state. So you can pick your polling place by what food you want to eat. And just one quick thing, they have in they're famous, virtually all the polling places, they're grilling sausages, and they're known as democracy sausages. And in deference to the views of many of our friends, we urge that there be vegan alternatives to democracy sausages. And a friend of mine in Australia told me, "Oh, we got those too." But so I got interested in this idea. My friend Bill Galston, a colleague at the Brookes Institution, and I wrote a paper 10 years ago just saying why U.S. should think about adopting this system, which has been in effect in about 24 countries over the years, a lot of countries in Latin America, actually. But the Australian system has been around one of the longest and continuous. And my friend Miles Rappaport, the former Secretary of the State of Connecticut, as they call the Secretary of State there, and a voting rights activist all his life, read the piece and came up to me and said, I've been involved in all kinds of reforms to make voting easier, to tear down barriers, to stop discrimination. I never run across this idea before. Let's put together a working group where we bring together people who have worked on voting issues in the U.S., lawyers and activists and academics and politicians, in some cases, and talk about this idea and see what it would look like here. So we put out a report through Brookings and the Kennedy School up at Harvard, and the new press was interested in the report and asked if we wanted to do a book on it. And so we have been trying. So Miles set up an organization off the book called 100% Democracy. And he's trying to get states and localities to experiment with this. He's had some success there. It's been introduced now in a number of states, Connecticut and Washington State, I know. And we think that this is the ultimate barrier against voter suppression because, it becomes the obligation of the people who run elections not to build barriers against voting, but to make it as easy as possible for everyone to do their civic duty. And we keep the penalties low and make sure they're not criminals, so we don't inveigle people in a mess of penalties or fines. It's much more a nudge than a shove. But it works really well in Australia. It's worked well elsewhere, and we'd like to see it adopted here. And the last point I want to make, some progressives get on us for this. There's no guarantee this helps the progressive side because there are some groups who would be brought into the electorate in larger numbers, young people especially, if you had a system like this, who tend to vote Democratic. But there are other groups like white working class voters, some white Latino voters, who would also be brought in in larger numbers who don't vote Democratic. Many of them vote Republican. So we're not interested in it for partisan reasons. We just think democracy should mean democracy, and that means everybody should be invited in, and that voting really is a civic obligation.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting idea. I hadn't heard about the Australian method. It does bring to mind, like, there are some states that have passed laws. You mentioned, like, they're providing sausages or vegan food. There are some places where they've said you can't even bring food to people who are waiting in line. I mean, that's how water. This is like polar opposite. And I will say that there, I think some on the more conservative side have actually stated, like, it doesn't help us to have more people voting. I think I think you probably are right. Like, we don't know what would happen if we actually had 100% voting in this country. We'd have no idea who that would actually help. But there is at least a language out there that some conservatives have openly used, which always seems to me to be like shooting your own. I mean, why would you go ahead and say that? But they do say, like, It doesn't help us to have more people voting, which feels to me like the most undemocratic thing in the world. And so I think it would be interesting to get some states, like, starting with something like maybe even a small state like Connecticut or, Washington to see what would happen and like what would be the results. I think we're in a moment.
I've had the idea that I would love, Utah and Vermont and DC trying this idea. Utah and Vermont, because Utah's a Republican state, but it's been open to political reform. Vermont or Maine have also been open to political reform. Right. I want DC in there because there's not as much diversity in those states. And so you would have a test in three sort of different kinds of places. There are a lot of other places you could do it. That's just one idea I have. And, you could also test it in cities and local elections. A lot of our reforms over the years have bubbled up from states and cities. Yeah. Laboratories of democracy. I think there is a famous Brandeis who said
a very famous Brandeis.
When we talk about that a lot when we are plugging our idea that this is a real case where you could have laboratories of democracy. The other thing, and I'll be happy to move back to where we started, but I've talked about this a lot as thinking about our elections having become like fancy dinner parties. At fancy dinner parties, people have A lists and B lists and C lists. And if you don't get all the A list people to say, yes, you move to the B list, elections shouldn't be fancy dinner parties. And yet they are, because people who not only are registered but vote regularly are on an A list and get all kinds of communication from political campaigns. Registered voters who don't necessarily vote often are on the B list, and unregistered voters are on the C list. Democracy shouldn't be like that. And the beauty of this system is every politician knows they have to talk to everybody, because the turnout will be closer to 90% plus than it is to 60 or 50 on a good day, 60% plus. And we think that could have some positive effects. A lot of voters who don't come in are not particularly ideological. So you might, I wouldn't guarantee this, but you might have somewhat less polarized politics as well, that politicians would have to speak to people who aren't necessarily all that political, but care about their country. And final thing I'll say about this, one of my favorite photos of voting in Australia are three people in wetsuits near Bondi Beach in Sydney. And they all know they have an obligation to vote. So they get out of the water. Their surfboards are leaning up against the voting booths.
Oh, my God.
And they are carrying out their civic duty. And then they are jumping back in the surf. And it just shows, I think, how deeply embedded the idea that voting is a civic obligation has become in Australia.
Yeah. Well, it made me think when you were talking about the A list, the B list, the C list, the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Bishop Barber and Reverend Theo Harris, they're really like, there's huge amounts of very poor voters who are just ignored during the election. The politicians have figured they don't have to speak to them and they don't have to speak to their issues. And part of their, thought is, well, actually, we should get those voters motivated. But, when you were talking about like more people coming and there not being an A, B, C list, it occurs to me that it would force politicians to be a little more universal in their understanding of what their priorities were and ways to get them a message out that actually really invited a more universal understanding of how we can build a civic society together that benefits everyone.
Yeah, a lot of civil rights groups have endorsed this idea. And I got to send my book to the Reverend Barber, somebody I admire very much, because if you look at the kind of economics of campaigning, people say, even progressives say, if we spend a lot of money trying to turn out voters who aren't going to vote, we're going to waste money that we should be spending on, on voters who we know will vote. Well, yeah, I get that, but that's a real problem because it creates a vicious cycle. If people don't ask you to participate, don't invite you in, you are less likely to participate. If you feel ignored.
100%. Yeah. Yeah, and you're more likely to just decide that democracy is never going to work for you, that these elections will never work for you, and you tune out and say, same as it ever was.
Yep.
Yeah.
By the way, I mentioned my editor, Diane Wachtel. I should have mentioned her name at the New Press, who has actually published an extraordinary number of books about civil rights and fairness and equality. And she's a great editor, and we are very grateful to her. If I might shout out Diane.
I love it. Good, good, good. You know, one of the things that I've noticed about you is your willingness and ability to talk to people across the aisle. I mean, you had your famous conversations with David Brooks. I'm just in this moment of just really radical polarization, which I have to say, like, I'm trying to figure out, like, what are some spiritual tools that you feel? I'm going to put you in the priest EJ Dionne. But what are some? I think we're sucked into this vortex of really beginning to demonize others. And what are ways that you keep yourself kind of sane and ability to imagine a way forward with people who you disagree with?
Well, first of all, I very much worry about myself as much as anyone else on this these days, because I think the degree of polarization has made political conversation much harder. I had a very dear uncle who was very, very conservative. And we spent 35 years arguing about politics, and we loved arguing about politics. And we were you could almost tell how polarized we were at a given moment by how high we raised our voices. But I never stopped loving him. And I actually gave his kids kindly asked me to give the eulogy at his funeral. And I made a point of quoting Richard Nixon. And I said, I quoted Nixon that because I think Uncle Ray would like that quote. But I thought if he heard me quoting Nixon, he might rise up out of that casket just to tell me I need to be voting Nixon someday. I worry that if my Uncle Ray were around, he might be a Trumpist, and that I don't know if we could have, we loyally argued with each other for 35 years. We loved each other for 35 years. And I wonder if those conversations would be possible. And you're seeing this, you and I have both, I'm sure, heard from people in families where they used to have robust political arguments. They didn't stop loving each other. And those are much, much harder now. And I really do ascribe that in particular to the rise of Donald Trump. I think that, we became more polarized over time, but I think it got a particular jolt when Trump came along. And so I think it's very difficult. I'd like to think that our religious institutions might try to do something about this after this election is over. The next 3 months are just going to be hard, and we'll have to live with that. But, I say this, and almost as soon as I say this, the rebuttal comes in my head, but I'll give the idea and then the rebuttal. The idea is, couldn't traditions where you have predominantly progressive congregations getting together with predominantly conservative congregations, doing stuff in their communities that they can all agree the gospel teaches about helping poor people, helping moms, helping kids, with schoolwork. You could get together and do that. And in the course of doing that work together, create an opening for dialogue, because one of the biggest problems in the country, which is not political, is something that Senator Chris Murphy, Governor Spencer Cox, a Republican in Utah, the Surgeon General Vivek Murthy have talked about, is the increasing isolation of people in our country. I think our religious institutions could try to bring people together. Now, as soon as I say that, you look at many of our traditions, and they have been split by politics. Right. And you're seeing that in the Episcopal Church, you're seeing that in the Methodist Church, and a lot of other churches. Catholics we are not, there's not a schism, but there is clearly a split. So I offer that idea and wonder, can we do it? But I think it's worth trying through our religious traditions, because I do think, at least in principle, deep down, whether you are a progressive Christian or a moderate Christian or a conservative Christian, you do understand what the gospel says about the poor, the left out, and the excluded. And you can't write those words out of the Gospels. And some people, I guess, might try, but you can't do that. And I've always thought a lot of conservative Christians actually do some of that stuff. They just don't want the government doing it. And that's the argument they make. Maybe we should try together to do some of these things because it is very difficult. The other problem is that, we are increasingly separated geographically from each other, that people tend to live in places that are overwhelmingly conservative or overwhelmingly progressive or Democratic or Republican. There's always been some of that. But there's more and more evidence that has grown. In our very liberal neighborhood in Bethesda, Maryland, I used to tell my kids that I always respected people who put up Republican signs because they had guts to do it in our very Democratic neighborhood. And so it's become tougher, but we got to try. And, one of the biggest questions facing us is if Donald Trump loses this election, will we have an opening afterward to try to rebuild some connection across some of these lines? I'd like to believe that's true, but I'd like at least have a chance to test it out.
Well, that the big question, the big part of that is like if he loses, it'll be another question entirely if he wins. But I think that the point still stands, and it is a really important question for like what does the future look like in this country. But I'll segue into the final question, which is what we ask everyone who comes on this show is EJ Dionne, what gives you hope in this moment?
Well, my answer to that hasn't changed much for about 15 or 20 years. I always say that I am incredibly blessed that I get to teach students year after year after year. And I always say one thing you do not want to become if you're a male as you grow older is a grumpy old man. And my students keep me from becoming a grumpy old man. Time will take its toll, but I hope not on the spirit. And I find, and this, by the way, includes students who don't agree with my politics. I had a very conservative student who was a great student, and she was looking for a job on the Hill, and I told her I will recommend you or denounce you, whichever will help you get the job. But these students give me a lot of hope, and a lot of them, obviously, these days, young people people under 30, under 35 are a more diverse group. They are a more progressive group. I think they are leading forces on behalf of progressive ideas in the country. So in a political sense, that gives me hope. But the whole generation, including students who might disagree with my politics, give me a lot of hope. So we all like to see it in our own kids, and I do see it in our own kids. And so that sort of gives me hope. The other thing that's given me hope in the last couple of weeks is how much people have come alive, that it took just one spark to create a different mood in American politics. And it doesn't mean the campaign won't be rough, that there won't be a lot of attacks, that we might well be at each other's throats in October, and maybe it won't feel quite as good then, although I don't know. But to see that people were looking for some opportunity to be engaged again and are taking it, that gives me hope as well.
EJ Dionne is a political columnist for The Washington Post, a best-selling author and popular television commentator. He's distinguished university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy and author of numerous important books, most recently 100% Democracy, The Case for Universal Voting. EJ, it has been great having you back on The State of Belief.
A real joy to be with you. Bless you.
Please be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. We need your help to keep making The State of Belief. Become a partner in this crucial work with a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And share what you're getting out of this show with the people in your networks. Let's get more people listening and keep these conversations going on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at State of Belief. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.